Hello and welcome to Food Rebels. I'm your host, AJ Sharp, and today we are diving deep into a subject that's very close to the bone and the dinner plate: ultra processed foods, something we've covered a lot on the show. They're everywhere, they're convenient, they're often cheap, but what are they really doing to our health, our kids, and the culture of food itself? Joining us today is Dr. Dolly van Tulleken, a powerhouse of empathy, rigour, and clarity on the conversation around UPFs, and has been a key voice in helping families to understand what's in their food, how to make real world changes, and how to reclaim joy and nourishment from everyday eating. It's not about guilt, it's about power and knowledge and reclaiming choice. Dolly, welcome to Food Rebels.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about, you are Dr. Dolly van Tulleken. Can you tell us a little bit about you and how you kind of fell into the world of, or went into the world consciously into UPFs?
It sort of started. I feel like food has always been something I've been fascinated by, and probably like a lot of people, starting with the experience of eating and enjoying food. But I think from a very young age, I was curious about where food came from, and that was largely sparked by a primary school trip that my wonderful inner London primary school organised. And actually, I was recently reconnected with the charity that does it, and I couldn't believe we got to go back to the farm where I went age 10 or 11.
Oh, wow.
But they sort of took inner city kids to a farm, and they would stay there for 1 to 2 weeks and learn about farming and food, and everything from the sustainability aspect through to the kind of health and welfare aspects as well of food. And so that felt very formative. And then throughout school, into secondary school, I was interested in the food area from a kind of environmental perspective. So food waste and growing your own food. So again, from the sort of where food comes from. So that's the kind of background to it, and then I was drawn into the world of politics. So kind of food didn't take a front seat until later, when I ended up in a think tank, and I had this amazing opportunity working on I was very focused on a different policy area, but they sort of said we've got to do something on childhood obesity, because it was a think tank focused very much on social justice, and there were all of these headlines. This was around the sort of 2015, 2016 era. All of these headlines about the link between deprivation and poverty with childhood obesity, and sort of they weren't a health think tank, but sort of felt like they had to explore this because of the social justice element. And I had a moment of being like, that is my subject. That kind of brings together all my interests in the kind of social justice side, what defines and determines culture, and then brings in this massive question around food. And I've always been interested in health as well, so it kind of brought all of these things together, and that was where the journey started for me. And it was through, although ultra processed food wasn't, I don't think it was even a term that was used in that time, around the sort of 2016 era.
No, I don't think so. I first heard it just around about COVID time. It was
Wow.
B. Wilson, I think, published an article in The Guardian about ultra processed food, and that was the first time it kind of come into my radar.
Well, I mean, which is mind blowing, because obviously the research history is longer than that. It's still quite recent, but we're talking kind of 15-ish years, sort of 2009 time. So it's an interesting story of sort of how ideas and research percolate then into society and become kind of part of the social storytelling that it is now. Obviously, it's been a kind of very dramatic few years of it becoming the term that feels like you can't escape. Every day there's an article published on an ultra processed food, which is absolutely fascinating, and my brother-in-law being, I have to say, very responsible in many ways for that.
So your brother-in-law, for the listeners at home, that is Dr. Chris van Tulleken, part of the twins. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're married to Xander?
Yes,
I'm talking about them like I know them really well. Of course I don't, but I've read the book and I've watched all the stuff on TV and I've listened to the podcast. I feel like I know them really well.
Yes, well, it's funny because my marriage literally came from my work on food policy, because it was Chris who introduced Zand to me after interviewing me for his book. So ultra processed food has led me to marriage and kids.
Oh, wonderful. Well, it just shows, doesn't it? If you follow a passion, you're going to find other people in the same space who share the same passion.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's incredible. So you were quite heavily involved, weren't you, in the kind of now quite famous book, Ultra Processed People. I remember listening. You're definitely mentioned at the end of it. And what involvement did you have in the pulling together of the book?
Well, there were all of these things happening at the same time. So around COVID, it was a really kind of interesting period of time for food policy, and a very exciting time and a very promising time for change as well. And I sort of think back to it now because we've had quite a depressing few years since then. But sort of 2020 and 2021 were these 2 years where we had the National Food Strategy. So the government had commissioned Henry Dimbleby, who was the founder of Leon restaurant chain, but had ended up basically writing the school food plan with John Vincent after being commissioned by Michael Gove, who was the Education Secretary of State back in the kind of 2012, 2013 era. And so he'd been commissioned to write with John Vincent this school food plan, how to make school food better and improve it. And they had done that really successfully, and it had led to some changes. And then Michael Gove ended up becoming reappointed, appointed in a different position as the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And in that position, I think because of the success of the school food plan, which had touched on one aspect of the food system, on school food, he then commissioned Henry to do this entire review of the UK food system at large to try and understand how government could help get it to be more sustainable and more nourishing. And so that was all happening. And at the same time, Chris van Tulleken and my husband Zand were doing this podcast on ultra processed food that had stemmed from this, mad situation where they were basically the largest weight difference of any studied twins. And they wanted to understand why that was. Zand was about 25, maybe 30 kilos heavier than Chris at that time. And they were trying to understand why. And they did it through this podcast. And Chris also did a TV show for the BBC called What Are We Feeding Our Kids? And that was looking at, ultra-processed food and the rise of ultra-processed food. And it was actually, Chris talks about this, but one of the producers on that show had come across the research in Latin America from this amazing group of Brazilian researchers led by Professor Carlos Monteiro, who's sort of behind the concept of ultra-processed food, the term, and came up with the NOVA definition, the NOVA classification, which is the most widely used of the classification systems for ultra-processed food. And Chris had sort of read this research that this producer had found and basically thought, oh my gosh, this is incredible. And this seems like in many ways the answer of the big question of why on a pandemic global scale are we seeing obesity rise so rapidly, and we're seeing diet related diseases going through the roof so rapidly. This seems to be the answer, this sort of rise of industrially processed, highly processed food. And so he did that show and they were doing the podcast, and Henry Dimbleby was writing the National Food Strategy. And so there were kind of all these people, quite big, kind of public figures in many ways, doing these big projects on food. And at the same time, in 2021, I just published this whole analysis of all government obesity policies in England, which had never been done before. And I don't think to this day it's ever been done for any other country. There's been one for Scotland, but no other place in the world has there been a kind of full analysis of all the obesity policies. I think it's quite rare for kind of any policy area. So I keep going around to anyone going, if you're interested in modern slavery or whatever, I was like, go and do this analysis, because it's so useful having a kind of history of why essentially government policies trying to solve a problem have failed.
Yeah.
And so Henry and I were talking at that time for the National Food Strategy about that work. And then Chris ended up interviewing me about it to try and understand why government policy hadn't been able to kind of tackle obesity, hadn't been able to improve food-related health. And I think a lot of people, even if they're not focused on the government policy element, are interested in why the government sort of can't seem to solve these big issues. So that had been my focus at that point for a few years of trying to understand myself why
Well,
government
he's
hadn't.
amazing, isn't he, Henry? I heard him speak at a food trade show event I was at, and I just remember coming away feeling so inspired by everything that he was saying, what he'd tried to do or what he'd successfully done with his Leon brand of making really good, nice food and making it much more accessible. And at the time when there was only McDonald's or M&S sandwich, it was a beautiful middle ground of something that was better than a McDonald's but quick and hot.
Mm.
And then the thing that I came away with, and I can still see it now, was he put up on the projector, well, not the projector, it wasn't that long ago, he put up on a PowerPoint it was a scale of government advice on margarine and obesity and heart disease levels, and how the advice in the 70s was all to switch from butter because it's got saturated fat to margarine, which is full of goodness knows what. And actually, the net result was a much more unhealthy nation. And I just remember sitting there, and it was the first time I thought, the government is not right about a lot of things that they really, really should be right about. And it was shocking that something that should be a fact wasn't.
Yeah, yeah, and that is essentially where we are today, and trying to understand how government policy can better reflect the kind of nutritional research out there. But it's so complex, and actually one of the reasons why government advice and nutritional advice has been sort of has had so many dodgy aspects over the past few decades has partly been because of the conflicts of interest and the fact that the food industry has been involved in the government policy process still to this day. Literally today, we have a government food strategy with an advisory board that has McCain chips, on the formal advisory board. And so when we look back at the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, this time where, again, the industry was very involved in government policy making, we're wondering why the advice, hasn't ended up contributing to good health. There are big commercially driven reasons for that. And the commercial relationship with politics goes back such a long way. And it's very, very difficult to unpick. And that's what I've been interested in with ultra processed food, is that it's not just about the questions which tend to be asked most in the media and by the public, and certainly for me on a personal level, friends and people around me constantly ask. They sort of ask about the products, like, should I eat this? Is this bad? What does this ingredients mean? Blah, blah, blah. I'm sort of more interested in the representation of the kind of industry level and the commerciality of our food system, and the kind of huge proliferation of huge corporate companies that have ended up coming to dominate our food system on a global scale, and what that means. And when you understand the relationship with government policy as well, you sort of have to look at it from that very, very top level perspective. And what's interesting about ultra processed food and Carlos Montero and the team in Brazil, and actually a lot of the people focused on this in Latin America, is that they really get the kind of corporate lens and the understanding of the commerciality and these sort of commercial drivers of health is at the very core of how they see this. Whereas we're still in a kind of, we call it a reductionist paradigm, but we sort of focus on the nutrients, we focus on the products and food itself. We don't necessarily have a more commercial corporate understanding of the drivers of health. And when you look at the language of what's happening in Latin America, they sort of talk about the role of these businesses and the purpose and nature of these businesses. They're not sort of going, oh, if we reduce a bit of salt in, some of the products, will it be better? They're going kind of, what kind of food system do we want? What kind of players, what kind of businesses should be involved? And how do we protect our traditional diet, our traditional food producers and our traditional food culture, that these commercial companies are sort of coming in and displacing. And so all of that language of displacing and commercial drivers and that kind of stuff is absolutely part of the narrative in Latin America in a way that it still isn't in the UK. And partly I think that's because we still have a huge influence of these very, very large transnational food corporations in government policy.
Yeah, I mean, you explain this in the book, but are there some examples that you can give now to just really paint that picture for listeners at home? Exactly how, what does this really mean that McCain's is sitting on a a think tank or a committee that is deciding our food? What does that look like?
Well, it's a very good question on the multiple ways that the involvement of business can influence government policy. But essentially, what we found using a recent example of the report that Henry Dimbleby and I did last year in 2024, called "Nourishing Britain: A Political Manual for Improving the Nation's Health." This was a kind of dream project that had come from doing this history of all obesity policies in England. You sort of can't help but look at these policies and want to ask the people at the very top of government involved in them, what is it actually like when you're dealing with these policies, and why can't you just sort of do the big thing? And one of the biggest barriers that we found in these interviews, which were with 20 prime ministers and health secretaries and senior other politicians such as former chancellors and mayors, etc., was the role of big business. And so they would describe being essentially in conversations in government, whether you were in different departments or around the cabinet table or in informal discussions or whatever, talking about the sort of policy solutions to different problems. And in the context of this, it was talking about what the barriers are to kind of food policy and obesity policy. And you would basically have these very loud voices in government that were saying, but, are you going to destroy these big commercial industries? The British sugar industry is a huge success story. Are you going to bring in essentially regulations that's going to destroy that and, result in job losses and these kind of dampening of economic growth? So you basically have a government that as a whole has these huge tensions internally between the priorities, say, on health or sustainability, food, etc., with, but what do we do about the economics? How do we make sure that we protect these huge commercial interests in these huge industries in the name of economic growth? And it's interesting how much and how frequently government sort of doesn't quite know how to reconcile that tension. And you can see it even in the food strategy that's being developed right now, and we're expecting it to be published this year. But they have said that, of course, they're ultimately wanting to achieve a kind of nourishing, sustainable, fairer food system. But at the same time, they want to make sure that economic growth continues and, that those sort of economic interests are protected. So they're sort of trying to find solutions that don't destroy one of those. And it's really, really difficult. So it basically results in this kind of risk aversion. And what we found was that, even within an individual career, so we used the example of Jeremy Hunt in the Nourishing Britain report, who was the longest serving health secretary. And he actually talked in the interviews. They're all our interviews are fully available, the full transcripts of the interviews, so anyone can go and read them. He talks about regretting not doing more on childhood obesity during his time in government. But then we show that when he was Chancellor only a few years later, he celebrated PepsiCo UK's largest expansion in 25 years, which its own video said that it would result in an 11,000 ton expansion of ultra processed.
Oh no!
So you
Shocking.
have this, but you want to see, you've got a government who essentially within an individual career, a person can be saying, what are we going to do about childhood obesity at the same time as, yay, PepsiCo UK is expanding the most it has done in 25 years. And even though it explicitly is going to result in that proliferation of kind of ultra processed snacks. So what do you do about that?
What do you do about it? Exactly. And I suppose for us at home, it seems really obvious that we should eat more of our own food because we know that we hold, British farming is held to a very high standard. Our meat is extraordinarily good when compared with many countries around the world. But there's also exactly what you're saying, trade agreements where we've agreed to buy a certain tonnage of probably agricultural output from different countries around the world in exchange for goodness knows what else that they're giving to us, that we then have to, and then it has to be sold through our supermarkets, who are then being leveraged in that whole process. And so at home we have so little choice. It's, that whole feeling that the supermarkets don't really listen to us. Well, they don't. They really don't. They can't. They've got much bigger levers pressing on them than people at home saying, actually, I'd rather eat British fruit and veg, or I don't mind if it's wonky, or whatever it may be.
Totally, and that is what I'm absolutely fascinated to try and sort of understand and try and answer in my work going forward. Because I want a good food system. I want a food system that is delicious and nourishing. We don't have to, ideally, in my dream world, you wouldn't have to think about whether you wouldn't be checking ingredients lists and thinking about whether something's sort of good or bad, or having to have that sort of constant day-to-day battle. I actually think that kind of world sits in almost like a nightmare sort of diet culture, where you're sort of thinking, you're having to think about it so much. I would love it if we live in a food system where you sort of know that basically most, if not all, of what you eat is not going to be sort of too harmful for your health. And how do you get there commercially is the kind of big question I want to understand, and trying to understand how companies, because we know that lots of individuals, I say we, Henry, me, others, are having conversations trying to understand how things can be changed and how you do move towards that kind of food system practically. And we know that there is so much good intention across, the agri-food chain, the food industry, lots of different types of companies, not just sort of one section of the food industry, because the food industry often gets talked about as one big sort of
conglomerate. Yeah, and it's very partisan, actually.
Totally. And so we're trying to understand literally what are the barriers that people in those industries and those companies face? Where are these kind of incentives coming from? Where are these drivers? And most importantly, what would help companies come out of them? And we know also from pieces of work like National Food Strategy, like Nourishing Britain, like other pieces of work that we've done, we know that lots of companies want to change, and lots of people in companies want to change, but need government regulation. But it can be very difficult calling for it if you don't have the kind of full support of others in this sector, because you will basically just risk losing your kind of market share or your commercial edge. So there are all of these difficult sort of tensions, again, within the industry to try and overcome as well. And sort of how do you basically build up a chorus of voices to support action for change? And I work very closely over the last couple of years with the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, and they've been holding these huge food conversations with people, representative samples of people across the country. And it's amazing how much public support there is for change, but how do you convert that into something that politicians feel the heat of? They feel like it's going to be something they're voted in or out based on. And we're not quite there yet with food being an agenda which governments have decided upon, and we sort of need to make it an election winning issue.
Yeah, I can see that, because all of the solutions I think that we can imagine aren't going to make big companies wealthy, so they're not going to put money behind it. They aren't going to make politicians win, so they're not going to put money behind it. So it's really hard, isn't it? I mean, I went to visit some friends in Lyon in south of France, and I was absolutely blown away by how beautiful the produce was, how beautiful the food was that we were eating. And when I was talking, saying, I don't think we could even get half of these ingredients. And they're like, oh yeah, it's really easy. We just go to the bakery and we get our nice, moule of bread, and we go here and there. And it was just beautiful, organic, incredible food. And I could see, opening cupboards and drawers. They don't have processed food. They don't seem to have it. They don't seem to accept it. They don't seem to buy it. I'm not saying all people across France, of course, I'm sure there's a sliding scale. But it just showed me this culture in France where they have protected, buying from local people, really good quality things, a real pride in something that's made only in one area, which means that you're not eating ultra-processed food. You're eating the food of the area that you are supposed to be eating. And I don't know how we can get to that sort of a place, because it's a change in culture. It's a change in food education, cooking education, something that Samuel Goldsmith was talking about last week. The culture and education around cooking is so much a part of this story.
Oh gosh, I mean, the culture question is such a fascinating one because I see it as totally part of this. Whereas in a lot of conversations I have about, the food system, how to change it, etc., people will sort of say, and especially if you're talking about other countries, people will say, oh, that's just, that's the French culture, or that's the Italian culture, or that's the Japanese culture. And I don't believe it, or I don't see it that way, because policy and other factors have been such enormous forces behind that culture, have helped shape that culture. And I think that's really important. For me, it's a very promising lesson that we can draw from, which is that you can take, whether it's government, companies, whatever, can take proactive steps to shape culture. And in many ways, our culture in the UK has been commercially shaped and shaped by very large companies much, much earlier than other European neighbours, which is partly why we have such a different food culture. But we sort of industrialised 100 years earlier. Our food culture started being dominated by kind of American companies much earlier than other European neighbours, although I always caveat this with our European neighbours are all sort of going in the same direction as us. So we sort of they have their protection, challenges really fast approaching at the moment. But the tobacco reduction policies that happened over the last sort of 20 to 50 years really have totally transformed our culture. We would have said that we were essentially a smoking culture decades ago, and we're now really not,
Yeah.
at a national level. And government policy, along with some other key factors, great academic research, etc., has absolutely helped that happen. And Japan is a really interesting comparison because I have a lot of people, particularly in government, who are interested in Japan, interested in Japanese school meals in particular, because they're sort of famous for being so good and so delicious. And you have, a head nutritionist in each school, and they are a very important person in that school, very highly qualified. And, all of those are very proactive reasons, which actually came from a similar history to what we had. So after the war, they had struggled to recruit enough healthy soldiers. And basically the government sort of said, we just can't have this. This is ludicrous that we literally have too malnourished people to be able to recruit a strong enough army. And so they brought in a whole load of reforms around nutrition and food in schools being one of them. Food in hospitals is also great. But they really made a proactive effort to invest and prioritise and protect food in a way that we didn't, despite the fact that we did have a similar thing after the Boer War, when we also failed to recruit enough healthy soldiers and had, in some cases, no men in certain places being able to be recruited because they were so malnourished. And we brought in, this is around 1906, we brought in weighing and measuring in schools, and there was some free school meals provided, particularly to those on low income. So we had sort of almost like early tiny little flirtations with the sort of reforms that happened in Japan, but nowhere near the kind of national level and the kind of commitment and investment that happened in Japan. And so we have seen a weakening and a kind of a deprioritization of food in a way that Japan hasn't. And so, a big question is sort of how do we get that relationship with food to a place in the UK that Japan got to very quickly after having experiences with that? How do we do that? And also just to look at the sort of measures, the practical measures that took place. And I always point to public procurement, food in public places like schools, like hospitals, prisons, etc., as a really good starting point for government. It has the power to transform food in these places. And we've just had an announcement that the government is expanding access to free school meals for all children in families receiving universal credit, so kind of all families in poverty,
Brilliant.
some might say, which is brilliant, but it is a step rather than the kind of total transformation of school food we'd like to see. And they're also revising the school food standards, which is great, but we're just nowhere near the level of prioritisation and commitment and protection that other countries place on food, which is partly what explains why food cultures over in different countries is so much better.
I can see that, and I can see, I travelled to Norway last year, and I was really aware that anywhere that you went to buy a quick sandwich because you were on the go or whatever traveling, the standard, the cleanliness, the nutritious benefit of that sandwich just seemed to be far and beyond what you'd get here if you've picked something up in a WH Smith or something as you're going through a train station. I mean, there are some good options out there, but generally the option's not great. And when you talk to people who are European, who have come to the UK, they sort of look at you and go, I don't know why you guys tolerate this. And it's interesting because I don't think we're choosing to. I think the majority of people have the same conversations of, I don't know why this isn't better.
That's interesting. Well, the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission is, representative of the population in the sense that they've got these sort of representative samples, and that's absolutely true. But sort of once they are shown the realities of our food system and what's driving it and the kind of impact it's having, then people really do start to say, oh my gosh, I don't want this, I want government to change. And we see a lot of it in the public polling and stuff. But there's an interesting thing, which actually Nick Clegg, former Deputy Prime Minister, Liberal Democrat Deputy Prime Minister, who was one of the people that we interviewed for Nourishing Britain last year, he touched upon such an interesting point, which was around Britain's quite unique relationship with food and class and identity. And that we, unlike other countries, he was actually, he wasn't sort of explaining it, he was asking us, why is it that Britain has this sort of weird tied up relationship between food and class, where good food is seen as a middle class, sort of privileged, elite-y thing that isn't very cool. Politicians, when they want to be seen to be sort of down with the people and relatable and normal, you will see them eating fish and chips, and they will be going out and pulling pints and eating burgers and
having a Greggs pasty.
Totally. That's literally the kind of British political signal of I'm normal. And he was saying, my wife comes from a very poor rural town, a rural village in Spain. And he was going, why is it that when we go there, everyone basically has a very good relationship with food, and they're very connected with their food culture, and it doesn't matter at all. It's not about class and it's not about income. Why is it that we as an island sort of don't have a really good fish culture, and we don't have a very sort of strong...
We sell it all abroad, don't we?
We sell it all abroad. So it was just interesting that he was touching upon something that is actually a kind of deep layer to unpick with the British food system, which is this highly, deeply embedded relationship between class and food, which has been embedded for all sorts of reasons. But essentially, you now have a situation where companies will sort of capitalize on that of, there are certain brands and certain types of food that are associated with youth, with cool, with music, with all sorts of things. And you basically associate it with the things that are very popular, and that absolutely embeds the sort of cultural connotations. And then we've ended up in this slightly unhelpful situation where good food, organic food, nutritious food, quite simple food, even talking about pulses and beans is literally seen as this quite weird,
almost hippie.
Almost hippie, yeah. And so it can be really difficult to try and unpick those identity layers, because you're literally talking about people's core perspectives of themselves and what they do and who they are in association with food. So it's not as simple as just going, we'll serve, if you go into a school, we'll serve, lentils to everyone. If people have those connotations with lentils, they'll be like, absolutely no way do I eat lentils. So building up that is almost requires the same marketing strategy that has been applied to ultra-processed food for more than decades. We're now talking about centuries, because some of the biggest ultra-processed food companies were started in the sort of mid-late 19th century. So
I mean, Cadbury's is 300 years old or something this year. Not that it's shouting about that, which I think says a lot. Anyway, moving on. I found it really fascinating as well that when I'm not on this podcast, I run a marketing agency, and there are a lot of brands across Europe and America who purposefully come to the UK to launch because it's such a great test ground, because we as a culture love to buy a product. We love a product that's got a functional benefit, that's got a flavor benefit, that's got something that's going to make our lives better. We are so bought into this concept of it's just one more product and I'm going to really solve whatever it is that I need to solve. And actually, it's the opposite, of course. That's what we're saying. But I found it really fascinating that I had this Danish guy, Finnish guy, a number of different people from different countries all saying, "Oh, yes, it's ace to go and launch into the UK."
That is absolutely fascinating, and again, is part of what trying to kind of understand the commercial drivers and that relationship between it. But that speaks volumes about the sort of association with brands. And I'd be fascinated to understand more about that in terms of the wellness space as well. The sort of food, we have so many health claims, and Chris, brother-in-law Chris, talks about this in ultra processed people. But you kind of almost only, it's not totally true because there are health claims on things like raw nuts that say high in fiber or whatever. But you basically only really get health claims on ultra processed products, and that's because we have a kind of nutrient profiling system. The way that we classify food and the way that we sort of regulate food is so focused on individual nutrients and individual vitamins and whatever, that you have this sort of, it doesn't matter if it's full of sugar, but if you've added fiber or you've added vitamins or whatever, then you can plaster that all over the front of pack. And I wonder whether it plays into that of sort of British culture has become used to the fact that a product you associate with having all of these added things to it, so it's almost like a wellness product more than just a food itself.
Absolutely. I think it's become this functional thing. And, this is a word that we never used before maybe 3 years ago, but functional drinks and functional foods, it's something that is now tripping off the tongue the entire time. And that's what it means. It just means fortified with a load of different vitamins. Not that that necessarily is always a bad thing. However, it does mean it's been processed, it's been messed around with, and often the actual pure format, why are you buying an orange flavored drink fortified with vitamin C when you could just have orange juice? Okay, it's got sugar in it, but at least it's pure, and at least it's, it is what it is. It's really fascinating how we as a nation have come to this point that we're looking for functional benefits. People will go along the bread aisle and find the bread that's been fortified with protein or something because they're like, well, that'll be better for my kids, because that's what marketing has done. And it's a huge quandary, I have to say.
And we talk about this, I can't tell you, like daily in
Really?
our household, because we're so fascinated by, like my husband is interested in the supplement industry, and this very much relates to it because it obviously sits in that sort of vitamin side. And I'm pregnant again, and I was pregnant very recently.
Congrats.
Thank you very much. And so supplements are a big part of this. And he was like asking why, what does it feel like? Because I bought Pregnacare for my first pregnancy, and I sort of didn't even though I've been in food policy and sort of this area for so long, I slightly didn't associate the relationship with it. But I bought Pregnacare totally, almost like the marketing strategy.
Yeah.
It was like, it's the perfect amount of everything that you need, literally what you're talking about, the kind of functional, I'm going to give my baby everything it needs. And we started looking into the evidence, and obviously it was sort of full of scary, dodgy things. But it then unleashed this conversation that we now have all the time. Why is it that we are so obsessed with these kind of products that have all these promises? And I can only describe it from a personal perspective, which is that it's more exciting, and there's a kind of purchase, like you've just bought something and you've got a new thing and it's going to work, and there's the greener promises of a better you and greener grasses. And if someone just says, eat sort of real food,
it's not as sexy, right? It's not
fun. It's just not as fun. It's not as sexy, and we are fascinated by that. Of kind of, it essentially comes down to a marketing issue. How
it does.
And Bold Beans Company, I think, is a great example of Amelia Christie Miller, who founded it. She has done beans a massive marketing service.
Yeah, really has. It's an incredible company, an incredible product.
It's totally, and how do you kind of get that across sort of all real whole food, where it's difficult, right? Because marketing budgets are huge for certain products because they're cheap to make and companies can make a lot of profit from them, which they can then invest in marketing and expand and grow those companies. Whereas that margin for profit is much slimmer in kind of real whole foods that don't have long shelf lives and are not as cheap to make. And so there is a dilemma of going, the marketing budget is just smaller for real food, so it therefore doesn't get the kind of marketing attention that cheaper, unhealthier foods get. So
But that's exactly it. The farmers are not going to put a marketing campaign together about potatoes. I mean, I'm sure there are marketing campaigns about potatoes. However, the majority of us who go and buy a kilo bag for a couple of pounds, you're not buying a brand, you're just buying the one that's there, aren't you? Because there isn't a brand, there isn't an identity, and we're so used to that connection. Whereas, to go back to France only because I was there recently and therefore it's in my head, they are talking about varieties of potatoes with this sort of reverence and adoration. Oh, I love a wrapped potato. It has this beautiful nutty flavour. And, they're really into it. And I'm going, I mean, I know about Jersey Royals, Maris Piper. It's actually quite hard to get excited about varieties of potatoes because you're like, it's just potatoes. But actually, there's this huge, whole massive area that we are missing. We're missing all this information, I think.
No, I'd love to know where the money flows in a system like France of who's kind of paid still to this day to almost do that the marketing and protecting and standing up for the kind of traditional products and the traditional foods and the traditional food culture, because I know there are trade bodies that are a lot more powerful that represent the traditional producers and traditional kind of set parts of the food sector in a way that we just don't have here. And there was a brilliant example sent to me last year of McDonald's apparently released an advert where they showed a child, this is in Italy, they showed a child going to a traditional pizzeria and sort of making a big fuss saying they didn't want the food. And so the parents then take them to a McDonald's and they get a Happy Meal and they're thrilled. And the trade association that basically represents the traditional pizza makers was like, this is absolutely unacceptable and a kind of assault on our
Brilliant.
one of our top Italian dishes. And so they released their own advert which showed the exact opposite happening, of a child being taken to a McDonald's and saying, no, I don't want this, and then being taken to a traditional
Amazing.
and being happy. But it was this sort of thing of going, there's money there somewhere. So I would love to understand how those bodies are functioning and how they're funded, and how how could we look at almost having something for some
Similar.
setups, to protect British produce.
Well, I don't obviously know the answer. The two things that came to my head is I think there's a lot of passing it down from the generations. I think that happens. But I think also one of the things my friends were telling me about was how the kids at school, everyone goes to school from 2 because that's just the system. So the kind of childcare is a lot better. It's a lot more supportive for both parents to be working. But they also have like food tastings. So every day they have a 3-course meal, and it might be remoulade or celeriac. It might be all these different things, and they all have to taste them. And they have a kind of rule that you're not allowed to say, oh, I don't like carrot. They'll say, oh, well, okay, well, you don't like raw carrot right now, but you like it sauteed and you like it cooked and you like it mashed and you like it, and you're allowed to like it in all these different formats. Maybe you don't like it raw, and you can't just say sweepingly, I don't like carrots, which I think would happen in the certainly my kids would make big sweeping statements like that, and then I give it to them more and more, which of course they then learnt not to say they didn't like vegetables.
Well, I think of you mentioning lovely, brilliant, talented B. Wilson, who is part of the charity Taste Ed, which is all about getting kids to experience that sort of taste-led and experiential food system, which they bring into, I think it's just sort of in the early years settings, but with much younger kids. And there are other brilliant charities like Chefs in Schools that do similar things of making sure that they expose children to a whole variety of foods, and do so in a way that isn't like, you are going to eat this and we're changing the menus and that's it, but completely going, what is this and what does it taste like?
Let's explore it.
Let's explore it, exactly.
we've probably got to wrap up, but I could talk to you for hours about this. I'm absolutely fascinated. Last question. How can the people at home support you and Dimbleby and your husband and brother-in-law in this mission to change food policy? What can we do at home?
I have one ask, and that is for people to contact their local MP. And I know lots of people feel disenchanted with politics, or that it's never going to change anything, but creating that heat, that sort of public heat, that politicians feel that this food is an issue that they will literally vote for a political candidate on, is just not happening, or hasn't happened to this point. And we're seeing it happen in different countries, which is really interesting. And I think if people can en masse get their politicians to feel that food is an important, vote winning issue, that would be an incredible transformation. And I think literally something that has never quite happened before in British politics. And I think importantly, there's a kind of, demand tone that people should absolutely be bringing to their politicians, that they want change and they think there is a sense of urgency about it, but also a kind of positive tone to it, which is what I try and bring through in my work, which is this is about a food system that everyone can enjoy. This isn't about something that's unaffordable, and inaccessible for certain people. This is about making sure good food that doesn't make people sick, that doesn't cause disease, doesn't end up with people literally dying earlier, being the most easy, normal, accessible, affordable thing for everyone that they don't even have to think about. And so I think the more that we can sort of paint that positive picture and make politicians feel that sort of voter public demand, the better. So contact your MPs.
Brilliant. So you heard that. Get onto ChatGPT, say, write outraged letter about inadequate food policy in the UK in schools, make it relevant to you, and get ChatGPT or any other LLM, more are available, to create a letter for you and get that over to your minister. Give it a quick read over. It won't take you very long. Just get that over.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Dolly van Tulleken. It's been absolutely amazing having you on the show. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and really incredible knowledge on the subject of ultra-processed foods.
Thank you so much for having me. A complete pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to Food Rebels. So you don't miss out on more brilliant brand recommendations, insider tips and inspiring interviews, please make sure you're subscribed to Food Rebels and drop a comment below. These simple actions, like subscribing or commenting, take just a few seconds, but they mean the world to us. And it doesn't just help Food Rebels, it really helps to support the food brands and personalities we have on the show, who are all trying to raise awareness. And if you know any brilliant brands, or food founders, or chefs, or campaigners who have a really great story to tell, then do let us know. You can get in touch with us either via our website, or you can reach out on social media. Our handle is @food_rebels_, and we love hearing from you. Thanks so much for listening.